Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and this is an opportunity today to look at a couple of issues. Obviously, we'll be looking at the elections last night, and we will focus some time and attention, especially on the Virginia governor's race, but might pick out a few others. Interestingly enough, the voters of Minneapolis decided that they didn't want to abolish the police department. And what does this mean for some of the pieces of legislation that are in front of Congress? Of course, our action item for you is the Build Back Better Act, and I'm thinking right now that a number of members of Congress are saying if Virginia is any indication of what might happen by the elections next year in 2022, we might want to back off from some of the things that look like a boondoggle. So those will be some topics we'll address. But we're going to move on to some other, because there is seemingly almost a workers' rebellion on this vaccine mandate, which is coming down very soon, as well as some questions about China. I have a piece by Oliver North, but also my Viewpoints commentary today about all the coincidences you would have to accept in order to believe that the virus did not come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So lots to talk about today, and that's just the first hour, because the second hour, as I mentioned before, and I did want to mention it again, we're going to be talking with Daniel Bowman. His book is On the Spectrum, and I suspect almost all of you know people that are autistic. I mean, our most next door neighbor has two children that are. A good friend that we run into when we walk does. We have people in our extended family. And so what about this issue? We've addressed it before, but it's been many years. And I think Daniel Bowman, first of all, has done the research. But second of all, he's also autistic, and I think it'll be helpful for you to learn from somebody who's not only researched it, but experienced it. It wasn't until the age of 35. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't quite know what was going on. And so we're going to spend some time there focusing on that issue. If you know somebody that has a child, a grandchild, a friend, neighbor, coworker that's autistic, you might even want to let them know that next hour we'll be talking about that. And if later they can't listen to it, you might want to send them the podcast, because I think this is an issue, as we have tried to address all sorts of different issues here on Point of View, that you will find very helpful. First of all, let's go to, of course, the particular race that everybody spent most of their time and attention on, although isn't interesting what's happened in New Jersey, kind of intriguing as well. But, of course, last night we had Glenn Youngkin actually defeat Terry McAuliffe. And the first thing he said in his acceptance speech was the idea that we're going to listen to parents.
We're going to press forward with a curriculum that includes listening to parents' input, a curriculum that allows our children to run as fast as they can, teaching them how to think, enabling their dreams to soar. Friends, we are going to reestablish excellence in our schools.
Glenn Youngkin, and then he was not only talking about the value of parents, but immediately recognized that though he won from some of those educational issues, he also recognized the need to address this very concerning issue about the cost of living.
We are fighting for parents and students and teachers and our schools. Friends, we will reduce our cost of living. On day one, we will declare the largest tax refund in the history of Virginia. We're going to eliminate the grocery tax, suspend the most recent hike in the gas tax, double everybody's standard deduction, And we are going to cut taxes on the retirement income of our veterans.
So a lot of claims and promises, and of course he will have a legislature that may allow him to do that. One more from him, and that is this whole issue of jobs in the economy. Kind of a big issue, and it was even in Virginia.
And on day one, we're going to jumpstart our jobs and reinvigorate this economy so it lifts up all Virginians. We're going to get this economy moving again, growing 400,000 new jobs, fostering 10,000 startup businesses. Friends, Virginia will be open for business.
One, just to be fair, to give you a chance to hear Terry McAuliffe. For a while there, he was making a point about, we're going to wait till all the votes are counted, and that's fine, but whether or not he would concede, and I thought you might want to just hear from him as he spoke as well.
So we still got a lot of votes to count. We got about 18% of the vote out, so we're going to continue to count the votes because every single Virginian deserves to have their vote counted.
Again, some of the things from last night. And just before we take a break, the first article that I've posted here from Philip Klein, 5 takeaways from the Virginia governor's race. Now, let me just hasten to add that every time you have an election, if your side loses, you always have some commentators that are predicting it is the end of the world as we know it. No, it's not. And if they win, then this is going to be an undefeated and almost impenetrable barrier that will allow us to win election after election. None of that is true, but there are a couple of takeaways, and I think Philip Klein did a very good job of describing those. So let me cover maybe one or two before the break and the rest after the break. Then we're going to move on to a couple of other issues. But first of all, he said that one of the takeaways is what he called the revenge of the parents, and that is the whole issue of whether or not Democrats were underestimating what he says the political power of parents. Don't ever underestimate the power of parents, especially of those concerned moms for their kids. And as I've said before, there is a tendency sometimes for individuals that are in the educational establishment to say, these are our kids. Well, they are, but they're also your parents. Have a connection there. And the idea of a loco parentis, wouldn't be a good Kerby Anderson talk without at least some Latin, means that, of course, obviously, there are the parents that have a responsibility. And the biggest gaffe of this campaign was, of course, when the former governor, Terry McAuliffe, said, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. This was not really, as he says, a gaffe. It's really kind of what the majority of individuals believe, because he provides you, if you'd like to read this article, with a couple of polls that actually show that a good number of people that have a D next to their name do believe that. And then if you look at some of the exit polls, you find that the electorate said parents should have a lot of say in what the schools teach. And those are individuals who, when answered those exit polls, went for Youngkin 76% to 23% to McAuliffe. So you can see that this was an election on education. And in some respects, that makes sense. Education should be a state and local issue, not a national issue, although it has been nationalized over the years. But once you begin to understand that usually the questions in a statewide race, especially a local race, have to do with a variety of other topics that have nothing to do with education. Obviously, the education budget, but sometimes it has to do with roads or particular pieces in the legislature that weren't passed, tax reform and all the rest, which you just, of course, heard Glenn Youngkin talk about. You can see that education certainly was a big issue in 2021. Will it be a big issue in 2022? I'll crawl out on a limb and say, yeah, I think it will be, at least in some of these primaries coming as early as February all the way into March into June. So we'll see. But I've only given you one of the 5 takeaways. We'll come back and mention the other 4 right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When do too many coincidences add up to something more than a coincidence? If your neighbor wins the state lottery, there's nothing too remarkable about that. After all, someone would probably win. If he won it again, you might start to think that was a remarkable coincidence. But if he won it the third time, you can be assured that the Lottery Commission would investigate the matter and not chalk it up to an incredible coincidence. Let's take that logic to the revelation over a year ago when we heard that the virus began in Wuhan, China. We were asked to believe that it did not come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but probably came from the wet market or from some animal in the wild. What a remarkable coincidence that the virus arose from the same city that we now know was engaged in gain-of-function research. Why do we know that? Well, the National Institute of Health issued a letter 2 weeks ago that discussed experiments done by EcoHealth Alliance at the Wuhan Institute that were testing if spike proteins in bat coronavirus could bind to the human ACE receptor on a mouse model. But that was only one of several coincidences that you have to accept in order to believe the virus did not come from the Wuhan Institute. Jim Garrity asks a good question. How many coincidences does the natural spillover theory require? He lists nearly 3 pages of coincidence you would have to believe. An expedition to caves in China collected bat viruses without protective gear. No natural occurring virus identical to the COVID virus has been found in any bat or other animal, and scientists cannot find any evidence of natural spillover. You don't need the deductive reasoning of a Sherlock Holmes to see that all of these coincidences point to the obvious origin of the virus. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Are there any lessons we can learn from the election last night? And a couple. We can learn some lessons from Minnesota and Seattle, for example, that being against the police doesn't work very well. I'll get into that in just a minute. But the first article we've posted for you today comes from Philip Klein. 5 takeaways from the Virginia governor's race. And the first one is what he called the revenge of the parents. Was education important in that election? I'm sure it was. Will it be significant in the future? I suspect that it will be as well. We'll see how that plays out. It is not just one election that causes people to say, okay, I'm not concerned anymore about critical race theory. I'm not concerned about transgenderism. I'm really not concerned anymore about very explicit sex education in the classes. I'm not concerned about the fact that most of our graduates are not reading or doing math at their grade level. I think some of that is going to continue on for some time, in part because parents had a chance, because of the lockdown, to get to see what their children were learning, or in some cases what they weren't learning. So anyway, that's the first point. Number 2, Biden is a millstone around the Democrats' neck. In this particular case, Phil Klein talks about if you look at the exit polls, and again, exit polls are not as random as you'd like them to be. So as somebody who's been doing lots of interviews on polling and those kinds of things, I'll admit that this isn't perfect. But nevertheless, if you look at the exit polls, 54% of Virginia voters disapprove of Biden compared with 45% 45% that approve. So right off the bat, you can begin to see underwater about, like I said, 9 points. But that really understates the intensity, because sometimes when they do these exit polls, they ask, do you strongly disapprove? Do you strongly disagree? And if you put those two together, strongly disapprove 46%, strongly agree 23%, well, now you're underwater 23%. That's a whole different kind of issue. And it is interesting how, in some respects, that parallels with what we talked about yesterday. If there's one mistake I keep making, and I'll admit it, I sometimes am just one program or one 24-hour time segment too early, because yesterday you might remember that I quoted from Byron York, who's the editor for the Washington Examiner, in which he talked about the various polls pointing out that it's no longer 2020, it's 2021. And the point he was making is, if you look at the Gallup polls, for years they've been asking, do you think government's doing too much or too little, or do you think government should do more or very less? Well, there are a few times in history in which the American people have said, we think government should do more, and one of those times was this time last year. Why? Because we just been through a pandemic, a lockdown, a real concern about trying to get a handle on what seemed to be a runaway pandemic. But if you ask the same question now this year, again, we're back to where it's always been. We think government's doing too much and should do less. So it's easy if you are a big government Democrat, if you're Joe Biden, if you're Bernie Sanders or whoever, to say, yes, we're going to do and have government do more and more. That made 2020 a year in which you could actually do very well. It actually works against you now in 2021, and I suspect will work against individuals in 2022. If you didn't have a chance to find that article, we posted it yesterday, but unfortunately the show for yesterday is not on the Point of View website, but you could probably do a search for Byron York, and it's not 2020, and you'll find it pretty easily if you go out on the internet. Number 3, Glenn Youngkin showed how successfully to walk the tightrope of Trump. And that has to do with the fact that he was working very hard to try to avoid being tagged as either anti-Trump or being with Trump. And you can see this because Terry McAuliffe, in one of these speeches, I think somebody actually counted it up, I don't think we have it on this page here, mentioned Trump. You would think he was running against Donald Trump instead of running against Glenn Youngkin. And of course, there is an assumption right now on the part of the Democratic Party, which may be flawed, but nevertheless, it's an assumption that if you can just say Trump and racism as much as possible, that's how you win an election. And I do believe that most Americans have gone a little further down the road and said, no, we're concerned about jobs, the economy, taxes, maybe having less restrictive COVID-19 policies. We're concerned about China. We're concerned about the supply chain. I mean, those are some issues that I think are going to be winning issues. And just simply saying Trump and racism or Trump and white supremacy, I just don't know that that's working very well. Certainly didn't work in Virginia. Number 4, it turns out, according to Phil Klein, that Virginia isn't as blue without Trump. Over the past 15 years, he said, we've watched as Virginia has turned from a reliably red state, primarily due to the suburbs and especially the rural areas, to a purple state, to then what most people have called a blue state. If you don't think so, Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 percentage points. And yet now you can honestly see that if the issue is not Donald Trump, and the issue is not that this is a Trump clone, although there were certainly attempts to try to make him be perceived by the electorate in that regard, then you can see how his victory actually took place. So, if nothing else, it was interesting again looking at exit polls. Don't want to, again, take these for the same kind of certainty as a full-blown survey. So, again, whenever I use an exit poll, recognize I want to, take it with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, the exit polls we have from Virginia showed that 52% of Virginia voters said the Democratic Party was too liberal. Now, that may come from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or some of the statements made by Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, whatever it might be. But the bottom line is, if you have a majority of people, Republicans, independents, and I suspect had to be some Democrats in this exit poll who all agreed with the fact that the Democratic Party was too liberal, you should have some soul searching. Now, I did have a conversation the other day with one of the people that we work here and saying, well, do you think that then we will have the people and some of the leadership in the Democratic Party actually do some soul searching and reevaluating? And my answer is, well, I think the moderates will, and we're going to talk about Joe Manchin and some of them in just a minute. But I think some of the leaders have demonstrated that when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump and everybody in the Democratic Party was convinced she was a winner going away, for maybe a few days they wondered what's wrong with our message, but very quickly then they latched on to, oh, well, Trump won because of Russia collusion, because it just made it much easier to say, no, it wasn't our message, there was some problem with the election. And I think there is sometimes a lack of introspection on the part of some of the people that are in leadership positions. And again, you can understand that. If you're a leader and then people say, I think our message was wrong, well, then people want to get a new leader. So I can understand why that happens. But I think it happens even more so in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. You may disagree, and feel free to give me a call. But I've seen this play out now over the last almost 12 years to get a little bit of a handle on that. But let me bring you to the last one. This is where I think maybe he said a little too much. He said 2022 could be a bloodbath for Democrats because he has been actually arguing that up until now, there's always been the question on the Republican Party side, what do we do with Donald Trump? You know, does he run? Does he not run? Does he endorse these candidates? Does he stay out? But the big question now isn't so much what the Republicans do, but the Democrats when looking at what should have been a couple of governor's races going away in Virginia and not even close in New Jersey, turned out necessarily to go in a way that nobody would have predicted even just a month or two ago. Real quickly, and then we're going to move on to some other issues. It was interesting when given the opportunity in the state of Minneapolis in particular, and this I think applies for all of Minnesota. We'll just focus on this. Voters in Minneapolis voted against ballot question 2. What is that? That would have replaced the Minnesota Police Department with a Department of Public Safety that would have fewer armed officers and lots of experts in mental health and substance abuse. Minneapolis, of course, being probably the bluest of Minnesota, and it lost by a 13-point margin. So you would not necessarily have come to that conclusion 2 years ago after the death of George Floyd, but there is what has happened in Minneapolis. Lest you think it's a one-off, just before we take a break, it turns out that the pro-police candidates in Seattle, at the moment, when we were checking this, were ahead of the anti-police candidates in Seattle. So who knows? Maybe common sense is breaking out all over the country. But when we come back, what does this mean? Because if indeed this election means anything, it brings us to our action item, and that is, indeed, what about some of these moderate Democrats? Are they going to feel more inclined to vote for this multi-trillion-dollar boondoggle or not? I think you know the answer, but we'll talk about that right after these messages.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Any thoughts that you might have about this election in New Jersey, this election in Virginia, some of the other propositions and other elections in places like Minneapolis and Seattle? By the way, we the other day talked about the fact that there was one proposition even in the Texas ballot which actually guaranteed religious liberty, and that passed overwhelmingly and will now be part, once it's passed by the House and Senate again, it's a technical procedure, will be part of the the Texas Constitution. So a lot of good news here. And for a Republican in the state of Virginia, they won all the races. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, of course, everybody's focused on the governor's race, but lieutenant governor as all the way down to the House of Delegates. So pretty much a clean sweep in Virginia. Then you go to New Jersey, which was supposed to be kind of a dull foregone conclusion, went right down to the wire. So there you go on that. And so what does that mean? And again, I think some people try to look at some of these things in a statewide election and expand it to an entire country. And sometimes that's a little bit misleading. But in this particular case, Charles Cook, who we think very highly of, has a particular bill, or actually article called Kill the Bill, which relates to, of course, those of you that maybe have not actually contacted your member of Congress about the Build Back Better Act, which originally was going to spend $3.5 trillion more dollars than what you're already spending right now. Now it's pared down to less than $2 trillion. And what's a few trillion amongst friends? But nevertheless, this thing is still a monstrous kind of piece of legislation that is so thick and so detailed and has so many toxic ideas in it that I would think that there would be more Democrats that would want to not vote it in. And this is why Charles Cook in the next paragraph says, these developments raise some really important questions. Why on earth would Senators Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, Maggie Hassan, and Catherine Cortez Masto continue to acquiesce to their party's foolish attempt to shove a set of FDR-sized spending programs, that means Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the so-called New Deal programs, through a Senate that is 50-50, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. Why on earth would a number of moderate House Democrats, who you can contact through this link that we have here at Point of View, decide to go along with that when it seems to most people that indeed this is not a winning issue and could be a very easy way for Democrats to lose the House of Representatives. I think that's a foregone conclusion, but as Lathan Watts likes to say so many times on this program, never underestimate the ability of Republicans to snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. So, of course, that's a possibility. But Charles Cook goes on to say, in the Virginia gubernatorial election, it was primarily about local issues, as is appropriate, in particular education. But this did not happen in a vacuum, he says. According to the exit polls, President Biden's job approval in the state is 45-54. I just gave you those numbers a minute ago. 52% of Virginia voters consider the Democratic Party to be too liberal. Just gave you that number as well. As opposed to only 13% who consider that the party is not liberal enough. Yes, there are some of those people in Virginia. You can find a lot of those on the West Coast and in New York, but you still find a fair number of those in the state of Virginia. 77% describe themselves as either conservative or moderate. In other words, 37% conservative, 40% moderate. But anyway, that's 3/4, right? Compared with 23% who describe themselves as liberal. And the point he's making is this is just not a prescription for victory, especially if you're a senator in, let's just mention the names here again, West Virginia, Arizona, New Hampshire, or Nevada. We just mentioned Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, Maggie Hassan, Catherine Cortez Masto. That's not a winning platform, and it certainly suggests that indeed this would be an uphill slide and an uphill climb, probably a better way to say that, for individuals who, if they voted for this particular piece of legislation, would then have to face the voters who would disagree with them in very significant ways. I didn't take the time to post this one by Charles Cook, but I'm sure you can find it out there. Kill the bill. And frankly, if you're looking for one more argument that you might want to make to your member of Congress. Again, you can go to our Take Action item, and that addresses that issue. But before we get into some other topics, one of the other topics I did put on the table is to remind us that there are things going on apart from the election, but some of them relate to the election. And one of those is in the background, the possibility that you're going to have fewer people working in various industries, businesses related to the federal government after December 8th. Because if you're not familiar, that is the deadline. And tomorrow, I'm actually going to be in Wichita, Kansas. And so looking forward to speaking at a Christian academy up there. And Dr. Merrill Matthews will be here with Molly Hemingway. And you really want to hear that interview with her on her book, Rigged. If you've always had questions about the 2020 election, I know many of you do, you'll be able to hear her, interact with her, ask her questions, make comments, and the rest. So I'm going to be up there in Wichita, Kansas, but let me use Wichita, Kansas as a great illustration because that's the first one on that second article we've posted. Because the writers point out that in Wichita, Kansas, nearly half of the 10,000 employees at aircraft companies, that would be Textron Inc. and Spirit Aero Systems, remain unvaccinated and thus are risking their jobs in defiance of this federal mandate. One of the union officials is Cornell Adams. I'm going to quote from him quite a bit. He says, "We're going to lose a lot of employees over this." You think? If half of them are unvaccinated and this mandate supposedly applies to them because they are indirectly connected to the federal government. And it's interesting when they ask the question, many of the workers did not oppose the vaccines per se, but were staunchly opposed to what they see as government meddling in their personal health decisions. Just a minute, I'm going to talk about some of the whistleblowers that have come out in the last couple of days about the various vaccines, but it wasn't necessarily, oh, I don't like the vaccine. It's, I just don't like you telling me to do it. The implication is a lot of them might do it if it wasn't so mandated. I don't know. But anyway, Adams, who is a lifelong Democrat, said that he would no longer vote for the party. Here's his quote: "They'll never get another vote for me, and I'm telling the workers here the same." I thought, whoa. When you have unions, which have been kind of the one of the foundational pillars, if you will, of the Democratic Party coming against you, kind of interesting. And if you wonder about this, the clock is ticking, because here is how this works out. Under the executive order by the president, Democratic President Joe Biden, it requires all contractor employees to be fully vaccinated by December 8th. But here's the catch, and I started doing the math on this. If you are going to get one of those two vaccine type of vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, you really would have to have the second shot at least 2 weeks before the deadline in order to it to actually fit. So if you are running the numbers on this, go back 2 weeks, and that's November 24th, that's the day before Thanksgiving. So if you are a federal employee or a federal contractor and you maybe have gotten the first, Pfizer vaccine, Moderna vaccine, and you need to get the second one, you need to do that before Thanksgiving. Or even though the actual deadline is December 8th, interestingly enough, you would not qualify, and we'll see how rigorous that is implemented, but that's the point. By the way, it does point out that if you indeed get the Johnson & Johnson one, it's a single shot, and you could do that on November 24th and still comply. Lest you think that, well, that's just Kansas. Okay, let's go to Seattle. In a rally outside the Boeing property there in Auburn, which is just south of Seattle, more than 3 dozen workers gathered in the driving rain to say that they would be escorted off the Boeing property on December 8th and take the vaccine. Others said they would pursue early retirement. One of the analysts said, "The mandate is illegal, immoral, and impractical. We're standing together against the company and the government trampling on our rights." So I can give you other examples, but I'm getting close to a break, simply to point out that there are quite a number of individuals that are saying, I'm going to lose my job. I'll retire early. I'll just have you escort me off the property, but I'm not getting the vaccine. And that all comes as the CDC just yesterday actually had a panel which they were talking about some of the things that were reported to the British Medical Journal from a whistleblower by the name of Brooke Jackson, who was a regional director in Texas, pointed out that Brooke was convinced that there were some problems and maybe even some falsified data in some of the various Phase 3 trials. And as a result, the journal itself even said staff who conducted quality control checks are overwhelmed by the volume of problems they are finding. So again, I suspect that may or may not be covered by the government media, but you heard it here first, and we'll see what happens with the British Medical Journal and the CDC and some of their investigations. Let's take a break. I'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just mention, next hour we're going to get into the issue of autism, and the book is entitled On the Spectrum. I think it's going to be a fascinating interview, one, because Daniel Bowman has done such a great job in this book to really analyze the issue, but he's also a fellow traveler, because it wasn't until he was about age 35 that he knew something was wrong but did not get that diagnosis. So I think it will be an interesting interview, and if you know people, and I can't imagine if you know a lot of people, you don't know somebody who is dealing with someone on the spectrum. They may not be totally autistic in terms of having to go to a special school, but there may be some differences. And suspect, even as we go through this, some of you might say, you know, I finally have an understanding for why my friend, neighbor, coworker, or even why I act this way, because maybe you find yourself there. So I'm looking forward to this interview and hope that it will be of help to you. Let me real quickly mention the other two articles we've posted here today. Took a lot more time on the election, but there's always tomorrow to cover some of this. But one of the pieces I've posted is by Dennis Prager, in which he says, "Is stealing wrong? Not on the left." And of course, he's making the case that we have more and more people that are willing to turn a blind eye to stealing. Most of the examples he uses are from California. I grew up in California, and I can relate to each one of those. For example, Walgreens stores in San Francisco are racking up 4 times the average amount of theft than you find in other Walgreens stores around the country. Spending on security guards in San Francisco is 35 times more than the chain's average in other cities. And Walgreens has been forced to close 22 stores in the city since 2016. And you can say some of them have to do with the economy, but some have to do with that. San Francisco Chronicle, the Safeway located in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood, I know where the Castro district is, was a long-standing 24-hour fixture in the Castro neighborhood. But as last week, the hours have been cut back from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. due to an increasing amount of theft in the store. You can go to Los Angeles. Of course, you have George Gasson, who is the district attorney. And of course, you have all sorts of ideas being presented about we won't even prosecute theft. For example, even Proposition 47 of less than $950. But then he goes into, well, why do we see this? Theft used to be taken very seriously, and yet he has 4 good reasons. And this is the third article that you might want to read in its entirety. But he says reason number 1 is moral relativism. Friday, I'm going to be speaking to a group about this idea of moral relativism, and we see more and more people no longer believe in absolute truth. Even born-again Christians, as my most recent survey that I find myself speaking about, don't necessarily believe in moral absolutes. And so if you buy into this idea of moral relativism, you have sort of a live and let live idea and say, well, okay, especially if you steal from a Fortune 500 company, who cares? And so it's not the principle or not even the money. It's just, I don't care. The second reason, he says, is the collapse of the Judeo-Christian value system and the accompanying abandonment and often disdain for biblical ethics. And I would agree with that as well. The places where oftentimes you see the greatest amount of theft usually are places where there isn't a great deal of biblical ethics. I remember a guy years ago telling me that when he was at SMU, he always had to lock his door because he was uncertain as to whether somebody would come in and steal the things that he had in his dorm room. When he went then to Dallas Theological Seminary, didn't necessarily cross his mind to even have to close the door because it's all Christians there. So, and I've heard other stories like that as well. You have as well. Number 3, Marxist morality. From Marx to the present, Marxism has divided the world into right and wrong between economic classes and all the rest. And there is, again, some great illustrations he uses of how that has influenced our society. And then number 4, the leftist view of non-whites, especially blacks, a view that conservatives have never shared. And that is, well, again, if indeed people are maybe not as moral, not as intellectually superior, many of the ideas that are sometimes even shown by sort of this patronizing view maybe explains it as well. Anyway, I think Dennis Prager really reminds us that we're dealing with a problem of theft. And it's one of the 10 commandments, and yet theft is something that is almost always ignored. And you talk to any small business owner that is open to the public, and they will tell you horrific stories about the increase in the number of people that feel it's perfectly legitimate to go and steal products right off the shelf. And, of course, you've seen some of these videos, some of them YouTube videos, where you see the security guard try to make a minor attempt to slow them down and then finally conclude that, it's not worth getting into a scuffle, certainly not worth getting attacked or even having a lawsuit filed against you. And so people just walk out of the store as if that's just a natural function in our society. And I think it's time for us to reassert some of those principles. Last piece is from our good friend Oliver North and David Goetsch, paying China for the rope to hang America. That's based upon this quote that I think has been attributed to Lenin. He's reputed to have said, "The capitalists will sell us the rope from which we will hang them." And I like the fact he says, whether Lenin said this or not, the message is prophetic, because after all, there is some question whether he ever said it. But whether he said it or not, we have seen that for the value of cheap labor today, lots of large corporations, he says, are selling the United States down the river. And this is of some concern. And as I pointed out just the other day, it is becoming more and more difficult to find individuals in all sorts of different venues of our society willing to say anything critical of China. And I talked, of course, about this Turkish Muslim who plays for the Boston Celtics that was willing to speak out against China. And everybody in the NBA is running for the tall grass because they don't want to lose the China market. But he's willing to be honest. And there have been a few others that have been. And of course, Oliver North then gives you some stories about that. One, for example, of a wholly owned onshore mutual fund business in the PRC by BlackRock, an American investment firm in New York City. He says this is a classic example of letting a fox guard the proverbial hen house. But he then reminds us of some things we've talked about on this program, and that is that oftentimes China uses our freedom to their advantage. They're stealing and then licensing various skills to rapidly develop their own advanced microchips and semiconductors. And these are some of the most essential components in all sorts of electronic things, from toasters to trucks and autos and military hardware, including, wait for it, hypersonic missiles. And so, again, Oliver North reminds us that China is an enemy. We have an administration that doesn't act like it. We have a corporate group that many times doesn't act like it. We have athletes that sometimes are unwilling to say anything critical of China, but we will. And it brings me, of course, to my Viewpoints commentary today, which has the title, Too Many Coincidences. Because I point out that if you were, for example, to hear a neighbor winning the lottery, well, somebody's going to have to win it. If you won it again, you'd be a little more surprised. But if you won it a third time, I can assure you the Lottery Commission would investigate the matter and not chalk it up to some kind of incredible coincidence. And that's what we're dealing with right now, because Jim Garrity, for example, just has 2 pages of all the coincidences you have to believe in order to believe that the virus was a natural spillover from the nature in one way, or even from the wet market, rather than from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So again, let's recognize that you don't have to have the deductive reasoning of Sherlock Holmes to kind of figure out how all of those coincidences probably aren't just coincidences, but point to something that certainly the intelligence community of this country have not been able to answer. Where did the virus come from? We have no idea. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, autism on the table. We're going to talk about the autistic spectrum. Hope it will be helpful to you, to other people that you know, and we'll talk about that right after these messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Our topic this hour is autism, and it is from this book, On the Spectrum: Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. And if you think about this is an important topic. We have in the past, and you have to go back quite a bit, when we have had discussions in the studio about autism. And I'm willing to say that most of you listening to this particular program this hour probably know someone on the autism spectrum. It could be a friend, a neighbor, a coworker. It could be a family member. It could be somebody that you were a student with, just all sorts of individuals. We do know that 1 in 59 children are diagnosed with autism, and this really spans the racial and ethnic and socioeconomic groups. And so I thought it would be very good to have Daniel Bowman join us. First of all, because he is the author of this book, but second of all, he's a fellow traveler. And I've said this before, that it's one thing for us to talk about drug abuse and addiction. It's quite another to have an individual that has dealt with that issue. It's quite a deal to talk about the different, if you will, strengths and intelligences. And then we had Kathy Cook in here to talk about those and how they fit. And so Daniel Bowman is an individual that has his master's degree from Seattle Pacific University. He's an author, poet, and also associate professor of English at Taylor University in Upland, Indiana. He also co-directs what is called the Making Literature Conference. He writes and speaks quite a bit on this issue of neurodiversity. And he is the author of this book that came out in August, and it is about 250 pages, published by our good friends at Baker. And so, first of all, Daniel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I would love for you maybe to tell your story first, because I'd like to, in just a few minutes, get people to maybe get out a piece of paper, and we will talk about the different categories and, if you will, attitudes and actions of people that might fit in some of the symptoms. But I think your story is so helpful because, as I understand it from your book, it wasn't until the age of 35 that you really got, quote, a diagnosis. You knew something wasn't quite right, but it took a while for you to even figure out what that was. Can you help us, maybe tell us the story a little bit?
Sure, yeah, and I write about this at the very outset of the book to try to set up what it was that put me on this journey. So in my mid-30s, I'm out here teaching at Taylor, and I ultimately have a crisis in my life. I had been seen and treated by some counselors and doctors for depression and anxiety and some other things. And it turns out, ultimately, they were just symptoms of something else. When I realized this, it came about through a sort of meltdown that I had that I knew was unusual. And
Sure.
I had to take a good hard look in the mirror after this happened and say, why is it that other people can deal with a surprise or a sudden change to their routine and taking away the structure that they're accustomed to, and why can't I? What is the problem? It's to an unusual degree. And I began to do some more research and press further in. And when I came across what has been called Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism,
right,
it checked checked all the boxes for me, and it reflected the way that my brain operates. And so suddenly I had some beginnings of answers, and then I had a lot of work to do ahead of me to understand how to integrate better, and improve.
And can you give us a sense of the spectrum? Because Asperger's is one example, and I've had staff that I've worked with in the past, not lately, but that are there. I have individuals that I know in our extended family that have that, and that may be different than some of the autistic kids that I know in our own neighborhood. One is almost next door, two of the kids, one girl, one boy, and then another one where they have to go to special schools, and they show all the characteristics. They can't look you in the face, and they move their hands around, and any kind of change in the routine is traumatic. So you have quite a spectrum, and can you explain that for us?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, there are these different areas. You call them characteristics or traits to speak more neutrally, or symptoms. And they include things like the ability to make and sustain eye contact, the ability to sort of have normal social interactions, and that can include people who are verbal and people who are nonverbal. And so, and then the other area that I would mention is sensory processing.
Right.
So you have folks on the spectrum who are unusually attuned to temperature changes, bright lights, especially noises and sounds. And that can be really extreme. And so, some people on the spectrum experience those things so deeply that it impacts their daily life in a really challenging way. And for others, the symptoms are somewhat more mild, but also can be challenging at times.
Sure. Another one that you certainly surface early in the book is trouble interpreting facial expressions, body language, social cues. If I can make a joke, well, that sounds like almost every male out in the country, but it is more intense, more difficult for some in that regard, or trouble kind of keeping up with a conversation, or sometimes even holding their hands out in clenched just to try to focus enough attention on what is being said. So in some respects, these become very easy to pick out because they obviously are so different that even young kids say, there's something wrong with Bob, there's something wrong with Sue, they don't act like anybody else, and they're just different. And so in some respects, to deal with some of that early on will keep them from thinking that, God made a mistake, or that they're actually totally defective, or they need to be institutionalized, because the kinds of things that people that are not autistic take for granted begin to be pretty significant challenges for somebody who's autistic, aren't they?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people communicate in such sophisticated and complex ways. And so when we're having a conversation face-to-face with someone, I think that neurotypical people, those who are not autistic, understand the sort of intuitively, they understand the layers of communication with body language and other kinds of things. There's much that's being said and communicated outside of one's actual words, whereas a person on the spectrum generally is going to focus in on the precise and literal meaning of the person's words. And that can be difficult. That can put barriers between people.
Oh, for sure. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to encourage some people to get something to write with, and maybe number 1 to 6, because you give us, I think, some very good things that most people somewhere on the spectrum have in common, some more than others, and I thought we'd just go through those because that's early on in your book, and I think that will be very helpful. And then we're going to, if we can, learn from you in terms of some of the ways in which you've adapted and dealt with that, and how, in some respects, your poetry has been such a great salvation. So we'll get into all those issues, and we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When did too many coincidences add up to something more than a coincidence? If your neighbor wins the state lottery, there's nothing too remarkable about that. After all, someone would probably win. If he won it again, you might start to think that was a remarkable coincidence. But if he won it the third time, you can be assured that the Lottery Commission would investigate the matter and not chalk it up to an incredible coincidence. Let's take that logic to the revelation over a year ago when we heard that the virus began in Wuhan, China. We were asked to believe that it did not come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but probably came from the wet market or from some animal in the wild. What a remarkable coincidence that the virus arose from the same city that we now know was engaged in gain-of-function research. Why do we know that? Well, the National Institute of Health issued a letter 2 weeks ago that discussed experiments done by EcoHealth Alliance at the Wuhan Institute that were testing if spike proteins in bat coronavirus could bind to the human ACE receptor on a mouse model. But that was only one of several coincidences that you have to accept in order to believe the virus did not come from the Wuhan Institute. Jim Garrity asks a good question. How many coincidences does the natural spillover theory require? He lists nearly 3 pages of coincidence you would have to believe. An expedition to caves in China collected bat viruses without protective gear. No natural occurring virus identical to the COVID virus has been found in any bat or other animal, and scientists cannot find any evidence of natural spillover. You don't need the deductive reasoning of a Sherlock Holmes to see that all of these coincidences point to the obvious origin of the virus. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Autism is our topic today. Daniel Bowman with us, and again talking about the book On the Spectrum, Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. It is published by Baker, came out in August. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a way in which you can order it either in paperback or Kindle. And for just a few minutes, Daniel, let's, if we can, talk about, I think you have like 6 examples, and this is what to help people look at. First of all, you may, as you hear this, think, oh, that explains why that particular person that I know or that particular student in my classroom is acting that way. It also might have somebody saying, wait a minute, I think that's me. So the first is we think differently. We have strong interest in things other people don't understand or seem to care about. But oftentimes, as I love that you talk about, the individuals that are sometimes that have autistic symptoms, they're really good problem solvers. They really pay attention to detail, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's true. In the subtitle of the book, The Gifts of Neurodiversity, sometimes I think that my ability to focus on the things that I'm passionate about, which for me would be the arts. For other autistics, it might be, writing code or cybersecurity or something along those lines.
Yeah, accountants, bookkeepers. I mean,
sure.
Any kind of detail, that's what they're good at. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're able to spot, patterns sometimes where other types of minds would normally pass over them. And so I do think that can become a strength. I've read accounts from Silicon Valley where autistic folks who are specifically recruited to work, at places like Google and Apple and so forth, are just tremendous problem solvers, and we really persist in solving problems where people may give up. And things can become unhealthy as obsessions.
Sure.
And yet, in terms of professional success, if I'm going to publish poetry, for example, at a very, very high level, I need to focus that amount of time and energy on it just to be successful. And so you'll end up seeing a lot of autistics in academia, in fact.
Oh, we certainly have. Again, number one, we think differently. Number two, we process our sensors differently. Now, you sort of talked about this a minute ago, but I have noticed this: sensitive to bright lights, loud sounds. And as a result, sometimes you see the same kind of movement over and over and over again. Can you explain that?
Sure. The sensory processing, I think, is one of the less understood indicators of autism. Sometimes people make a lot of the ability to sustain eye contact or the social awkwardness and things like that. But very frequently, those things occur within the context of a sensory processing disorder. And so it's very, very difficult to focus on the conversation, or let's say a child in school focus on what the teacher is explaining, if the temperature in the room is too warm and that kid is going to be crawling out of his skin. Or if the kid, here's a common example, if the kid has a new shirt that the parents bought and it's got a tag that's really itchy because that kid's skin is more sensitive than the average kid.
Right.
And that's going to overwhelm the ability to do just about anything else.
Good point. Again, number two, we process our sensors differently. Number three, we move differently. That one was new to me because I've seen some of these others that you described, but again, sometimes the fine motor skills or coordination. I've always thought rocking back and forth and things like that was just trying to react to it, but some of that could be just trying to get your muscles and your fine-tuning muscles and coordination to come together. Isn't that a possibility?
Yeah, certainly. Autistic people tend to have a different posture and a different gait, a different way of walking that can be noticeable if you're really attuned to it, and you've seen a lot of us. And in some cases, there will be stimming or self-stimulatory behaviors, which you'll see is a sort of a emotional regulatory mechanism. So a child who's really happy, an autistic kid who's very excited, may flap their hands or rock back and forth or do some of those kinds of things, or maybe have verbal tics or other physical movements that seem unusual and sometimes scare people. They sometimes will scare parents when those things manifest at a young age. But generally speaking, they're just a built-in self-regulatory behavior that helps them regulate their emotions.
Sure. Number four, we communicate differently. And again, you've talked about the fact in this book that some autistic people use augmentative or alternative communication, called AAC, and so they may communicate by typing on a computer, spelling on a letterboard, or pointing to pictures on the iPad. So again, that is part of just the way that not only they perceive information, but the way they communicate it back to others, isn't it?
Right. And I think, there's so many different layers to that, and I'm not an expert on them. But I can say from my point of view as one who's verbal and perhaps hyperverbal, that the difference in communication extends to some more nuanced areas. For example, an autistic person might listen carefully when someone is speaking and then may relate a story of their own. And sometimes it'll sound like, well, you weren't really listening. You're trying to outdo me or trying to put the spotlight on you. But in fact, it's a method of relating that comes more naturally. They're trying to say, no, I understand. I've been through something similar, and I want to connect with you.
Yes, and that's important. They're not trying to one-up you or not trying to change the conversation. They're kind of showing empathy or sympathy to what you've just said.
Right, in the way that they know how, right.
Two more real quickly. We socialize differently, and I oftentimes would say that if I met a young child that could never look at me, I would say, well, maybe they're autistic. Sadly, now I'm saying, well, no, they might be spent too much time in front of a computer or a cell phone, but that is certainly the case. Oftentimes very difficult if they tend to look away from you and never look at you, or even maybe eye contact is uncomfortable. That might be a clue, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's nuanced across the spectrum, and it manifests in many different ways. It is tough. It's still tough for any of us if someone comes in the room and we're trying to have an interaction, a quote normal interaction, and the person's unable to make or sustain eye contact for very long. I guess I've learned to do it because I teach, and so when I first started teaching high school years ago, I had to learn how to connect with the audience and how to be in charge of a room. But many autistic people avoid those environments because they are so uncomfortable, and so end up communicating quite differently in that way.
Well, again, when you think about even some of the media, The Good Doctor, which is on television, of course, The Chosen, Matthew plays an individual that is autistic. There's maybe a lot more understanding and appreciation for that. But number 6 is we might need help with daily living. It takes a lot of energy to live in a society built for kind of what you call neurotypical individuals, non-autistic individuals, but you might need help in doing some of the kinds of things that, for example, many of us might take for granted, right?
Sure. I've come to think that one of the factors that's challenging for me and for many people on the autism spectrum is that our batteries need to get recharged more frequently. And so that can be really tough. In a career like mine, I've chosen to be at a small Christian liberal arts school, and I love this environment. I love Christian higher ed, but it's a busy environment. And the autistic person is going to need to steal away in the midst of a day like that and perhaps even take a nap, just physically rest.
Sure.
So we need to recharge a little bit more, and usually that recharging comes in the form of alone time and downtime.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, first of all, let me open up the phones. I suspect some of you might want to ask a question of Daniel, and that is certainly appropriate, 1-800-351-1212. But I also want to talk about what we can do, because there's chapters on autistic culture making. What about autism and the church? And then even how, in some respects, writing, teaching, and learning, of course, your poetry. I have a producer who is an actor and talked about how, in some respects, acting has been helpful, as well as writing and all these things for learning and helping people that are autistic. So there are just a lot of things we can talk about in terms of positive actions, but we wanted to cover this today. And again, if you did not catch the title of the book, it came out in August, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link to On the Spectrum, and it is Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. It's published by Baker. You can get it in paperback or Kindle. We have information about that on our website. Let's take a break. We'll also take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Got a lot to cover. We will do that right after these messages.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the view.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Daniel Bowman Jr. as we talk about his book, On the Spectrum, Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Missouri. KTTK and Jamie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you very much. I was wondering, I would like to ask your guest, Daniel, and Daniel, thank you for bringing this topic right to the forefront. But I was wondering, you said you didn't have a diagnosis of being in the autism spectrum until your 30s. And I wondered, did you regret that your parents didn't pursue a diagnosis? And how did they react to your diagnosis?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. It's hard to look back at my childhood and try to figure out what it might have been like if I had a diagnosis. As a kid in the 80s, it wasn't common, and so it's kind of hard to imagine. I guess part of me would like to have had some more support because there were areas where I really struggled, and that includes executive functioning. So things like time management and how to stay on task and how to stay organized in school. I really lacked those skills, and that hurt me a lot. But it never rose to the level of seeking any kind of diagnosis because I also was intelligent and articulate, and I could do well in school when I was able to. And so I think, writing the book now, I feel like more people are positioned to get diagnosed, and I think that's helpful for today's generation. So I'm really grateful to be part of that.
And again, I appreciate you writing the book. It's one that I know I'll recommend. We talked about a book years ago, but this one, because you went through it yourself, is even more poignant. And also just how you've been able to use poetry and those sorts of things to really connect with individuals. But before I went to the break, I mentioned autism in the church. I do know that a number of people listening to this right now might be pastors, Sunday school teachers, Bible fellowship leaders, or others that might say, I don't think we've ever even addressed this issue from the pulpit. We certainly have never talked about it in a Sunday school class. We've never really tried to even have a program to deal with people that learn or behave maybe differently. What might you say to them?
Yeah, I have gotten some interest in recent months from folks in the church, and I'm so excited about that because my position in writing this book is really I think it expands beyond autism. I think it's an idea of if we're called to love God and love our neighbor, as Jesus calls us to do, then we have to learn some things about our neighbor. And so the first thing I would say to a pastor or to anyone running a youth program or anything in the church is, aside from the research and from clinical books by doctors, which often tend to pathologize autism and just talk only about deficits, try to begin reading some books like mine or some blog posts or things like that from actual autistic people. And then you'll hear from our point of view, our daily lived experience. And I think that'd be really useful in learning how to love us. The way that I think about it is if someone moved into my neighborhood who was a refugee, let's say from a different country, from, let's say, the Middle East, I would want to bring them a meal or do some kind of welcoming gesture to show love. But I would have to do a little bit of research to try to understand who they are first, and so I could love them well, and try to meet their needs.
So again, I want to talk a little bit more about how you've used poetry, because you do talk about that. But let's take at least one more phone call, and we'll go to North Carolina on the Good News Network. Nancy, thank you for joining us today. Tell us your story.
Yes, hi, Kerby and Daniel. Thank you so much. I have a son who is 32. He was diagnosed at the age of 4. So it's been a rough road for him. He is mild to moderate on that spectrum, but also there is some mild mental retardation there. But he has done very well. He's overcome many challenges. The biggest one, though, that I've had the last 2 years is he has been very depressed, very lonely, and of course with COVID, this affects him in a different way. I had one of my sisters told me that one of her friends said her child said, okay, now you all know how it feels to be afraid. And that was very strong, very poignant, and it broke my heart because I knew what my son was going through. But my problem for him is just finding groups that I can get him into. So much is out there when they are children and they're growing up. But then once they get out of school, 18 or 19, there's nothing. You don't have that strong support network that you need to have for them and that they need so much. And, thank God, I'm so thankful that, he is a Christian and he knows the Lord because, we know that we can always lean on the Lord for anything and everything. But it still hurts you as a mother that you can't do more for him, that you can't make people accept him or, to invite him to go out with them, to a restaurant or something like that. And so it's just been a struggle. And so, I'm just hoping that maybe you might have some suggestions or something like that. And again, thank you so much. God bless you both for talking about these things.
Let me encourage our listeners, first of all, to pray for Nancy and her son, and she's in North Carolina, and I think she represents probably what hundreds of listeners probably could say if they were able to get on the phone. And Daniel, do you have some suggestions? If nothing else, I'm hoping this book and others could be a springboard to provide for adult individuals who are on the spectrum to have some places of meeting and connection. And of course, part of that should happen within the church, but I recognize some churches are fairly small, but certainly larger churches could provide that. But what would you suggest for Nancy?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story, Nancy. I really appreciate that, and I understand it is very, very tough, and especially during the time of COVID when we were not able to meet in person as often as we wanted to. It's not a perfect answer by any stretch, but I would say for me, when I first was diagnosed and I was really struggling, and of course my diagnosis, as I mentioned, came out of crisis, I was very depressed and very upset and seeking answers. One of the elements that helped me a lot was connecting with autistic people on social media. And so while social media has its downfalls, on Facebook, there are particular groups, and sometimes they're closed groups that are only open to autistic people. So they'll ask you a question when you try to sign in. Are you autistic? And what they're trying to do is just make a safe space for people to make friends, and that could be nationally or even internationally. I use Twitter a lot, and so I was on Twitter finding friendship in the United Kingdom and Australia and all around the world. And honestly, they're not just online friends. They have become real friends. And in some cases, I actually meet them in real life at a conference on autism or on creative writing or something like that. So the other thing that plays into that is that being online can be easier for autistic people sometimes because we struggle with face-to-face interactions to some extent. It can be a happier place for us to have online friends. So that's been a real blessing in my life, and I'll pray for you that your son could find a encouraging and supportive group of folks out there.
Let me just mention, too, that your book in the very back has almost 9 pages of endnotes to some of this. And even as I went through those, I thought, I didn't know these kinds of articles existed, and that would certainly be helpful and encouraging. Now, I actually have what's called an advanced reading copy, not the final, so there may be some other things that you've put in your book, but there are some great resources there. And I might just mention that if somebody really wanted to connect up with you, since you are a professor of English at Taylor University there in Upland, Indiana. That's a possibility. But let's take a break.
Certainly.
And when we come back, I'd love for just a few minutes for you to share, because of how poetry and literature and others have been helpful. Of course, you've also talked a little bit about bad Christian stories, so we'll get into that too. But you have some poems and you have some other illustrations about how that was helpful. And it does show me once again the value of the arts. We oftentimes talk about the value of the arts and the need for the church to really focus on that. And I think there's tremendous therapy involved with that. So I'd love to give you a chance to talk about a little of that. And most importantly, for those of you that maybe know somebody that is autistic, or you fear might be, or wonder if they might be, or you don't know what to say, this is a book that I think would be just a great resource. On the Spectrum, Autism, Faith, and the Gift of Neurodiversity. Daniel Bowman been with us. We'll continue with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Autism is our topic, and Daniel Bowman with us as we talk about his book, On the Spectrum. And Daniel, before we take another phone call, I thought we might have you for just a few minutes talk about how this area of specialty that you're in, that is literature and the arts, especially poetry, has been helpful not only to you, but in terms of just addressing this issue of autism, and maybe even show some of the strengths of this idea of neurodiversity. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Yeah. For me, I came to poetry long before I had an autism diagnosis, but I I didn't necessarily know why. I just knew that it appealed to me, and that I had some talent with language, and I liked English classes when I was in school. But then, really, I think what God revealed to me at some point was that the level of sensitivity that's typical of an autistic person, the very intense way that we interact with the environment with our sensory processing, is actually exactly what's needed for a poet or for a watercolor painter or some other artist, somebody who engages at a very intense level with the environment and can see things that other people may not notice. That's often what ends up making it a good poem, I think. And so I was able to turn this thing that could be a burden at times into a bit of a gift by specializing in it.
One of the things I just mentioned in passing is probably worth at least explaining. You have a chapter on the insidious nature of bad Christian stories, and I thought, again, I'd let you maybe just focus on that for a minute, because I thought that was maybe helpful for people to know about as well.
Sure. For me, I teach creative writing, I teach storytelling, and so really my calling is to make young people stronger writers.
Right.
And what I put in that chapter and in other places, what I explore is really it's about human complexity. Mm-hmm. I think bad Christian stories are ones where you have a character perhaps who is an unbeliever and does bad things, and then maybe gets saved at the end of the story, and it's all wrapped up with a tidy bow. Whereas,
happily ever
stories,
after, right? Happily ever after.
Right.
Doesn't happen
better
that way.
Stories,
yeah.
The problem with those stories is that they can be comforting at times when we need comfort, and I understand that. I watch plenty of TV and read books that just simply bring me comfort, but they often don't challenge us out of our comfort, and oftentimes I find that's more what we need. Stories that are too tidy like that don't reflect people's lived experience, because our lived experience is very complex. And so I like to teach people to be very vulnerable and honest in their writing, and to address the deep complexities of being human.
Let's see if we can take another phone call. Stefania and Georgia, thank you for calling today. You're on with Daniel Bowman.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I have a 11-year-old son who is outrageously intelligent. He is a wonderful boy. But a couple of years ago, we had a young man with Asperger's. He's a homeless man stay with us. And so I became familiar with somebody that was on the spectrum. And just a couple weeks ago, I was at the kitchen table having a conversation with my son. And there were things about the conversation that were very reminiscent of our time with the boy with Asperger's. And so the seed was planted, but then listening to the program today, my husband and I thought, we should listen to this, because this crossed my mind a couple weeks ago, and nearly everything that you're saying is, there are things that how to put it, I don't know how to put it, but markers, I guess you could say, that would lead me to believe that we should pursue a diagnosis with my son. I started sobbing in the kitchen when I came to this conclusion, and because unfortunately the things that he's gotten in trouble for over the years and trying to parent him and things like that would be things like sensory issues and having, difficult, thinking that maybe the conversation he was trying to manipulate things when that might not be the case at all. So anyhow, that's neither here nor there. My question is, now what? If we suspect that we need a diagnosis or to pursue a diagnosis, what do we do? Do we reach out to the school, to his pediatrician? Now what? What would you say?
Daniel? Yeah, what would you say?
Yeah, I thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you listening today. I think for me, I would go with the family practitioner first, whoever the family doctor is, or if there's a pediatrician that he's comfortable with. And oftentimes they can at least begin an assessment, and then folks can be brought in, like a school psychologist or a counselor or things like that, because they typically have at least a little bit of training in autism. And nowadays, more and more, they've been exposed to some of these traits and characteristics, and so they're able to recognize it. And I think it's a really important step just to affirm and validate where you are right now, to try to pursue a diagnosis, because if it is there, in fact, then those miscommunications and those misunderstandings that are so common, he could, in fact, have some support and some structure that would allow him to flourish in the school environment and even in the social environment to some extent. So I think that's a wonderful start.
Let me just mention that we're just about out of time. And again, the book is On the Spectrum, Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. Whole section on foundations, which I think would be very helpful. I gave you kind of 6 markers as we talked about it, or identifiable traits or characteristics that might be important. Whole section on place, community, worship, and service, which I certainly would encourage pastors and Sunday school teachers to read. Writing, teaching, and learning, family and identity, but then at the end, 3 different interviews with Molly, Jenna, and Brian on spectrum issues, new directions, and of course some of the great material that you have there in the back. And most importantly, I would say that if anybody still had questions, Daniel, because you are at Taylor University, people can find information about you, because we actually do have a link on our website to both your Twitter account and your Facebook page. So that would be a very easy way for people to move out and talk to you. But most importantly, this book's been out for a couple of months. I would hope it would be in your local bookstore, but you know what? If it's not, we have a link so that you can get it either in paperback or in Kindle. It's actually part of Brazos Press, which is just an imprint of Baker, and it is a great resource, and it has been a delight to have you on the program. So thank you for writing about this. And Daniel, thank you for sharing your own story with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been just wonderful. I appreciate it.
We are just about out of time. Let me just mention, if you had not heard me say earlier, I will be out tomorrow. We'll have Dr. Merrill Matthews here, but you certainly do not want to miss that program, because for those of you that have maybe had some questions about the election, we are going to be he'll be talking about Molly Hemingway's book, which is called Rigged, and I think you will really appreciate that conversation. He'll be with us then on Friday, because I'll be coming back from that engagement. And then I got some other activities here as well. It is amazing how many things which were scheduled back in the spring that all seem to get moved into November. So I'm going to be out a little bit, but we'll be playing an occasional tape and have some guest hosts, and you'll get a chance to hear from me soon enough. But I wanted to make sure I was here at least to the day after the election in Virginia, and of course some of the other things taking place. So if you find yourself saying, I want to know a little bit more about some of the things you've covered today, we've posted a couple of those articles on the website, pointofview.net. Of course, we've posted a way in which you can get this book, On the Spectrum. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew for his help and Steve for his help. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.